For centuries, one army ruled the world with fear, precision, and unstoppable power. The Roman legions weren't just soldiers, they were a machine, forged in discipline, sharpened by strategy, and unleashed with ruthless perfection. Enemies outnumbered them. Empires outmatched them. But Rome didn't break. Rome adapted. Innovated. Dominated. This is the untold story of how a small city on the Tiber built the deadliest war engine in human history and how its tactics still echo on today's battlefields.
Dawn breaks over the Padus River Valley, 229 BC. 28,000 Roman soldiers stand in formation, watching 50,000 Celtic warriors prepare for battle across the misty ground. The Allobroge Confederation has never lost a fight on their own soil. They've already destroyed 3 Roman armies. This morning, they're certain they'll destroy a 4th. But Marcus Claudius Marcellus, the Roman consul commanding this outnumbered force, is about to attempt something that has never been done before. He's going to throw away 500 years of Roman military tradition. He's going to ask his soldiers to do the one thing Romans are trained never to do: allow the enemy to break through their lines. If his untested tactical theory works, Rome will discover a new way of fighting that will carry its eagles across 3 continents. If it fails, the Republic remains trapped as a regional power, and Marcellus becomes the consul who led thousands of men to pointless death. One battle, one radical idea, the entire future of the ancient world hanging in the balance. Before we dive into this story, I want to ask something. If you're curious about how a single afternoon of combat changed military history forever, how intelligence and adaptation defeated raw courage, I'd be grateful if you'd like this video and leave a comment. It genuinely helps this story reach more people who love history. And here's a question to carry with you. If you were a Roman soldier in that valley, would you trust your commander enough to let enemy warriors charge past you? Would you bet your life on an untested plan? Because that's exactly what 28,000 men did on a cold morning in Celtic Gaul. And what happened next would echo through 2,000 years of warfare. This is how Rome learned to dominate the ancient world. The Allobroge Confederation controlled the fertile valleys of Cisalpine Gaul, the region Romans called Gaul this side of the Alps. These weren't scattered tribes fighting with stone weapons and animal skins. These were organized, sophisticated warriors who had been perfecting their craft for centuries. Their army of 50,000 represented the largest coalition of Celtic clans ever assembled in northern Italy. The royal clan held the center, 3,000 elite warriors marked by bronze torques around their necks, symbols of proven kills in single combat. Each of these men had sworn blood oaths to their war chief Brennus, vowing to die before retreating. They meant it. Celtic culture valued death in battle above all other fates. To die old in your bed was shameful. To die with a sword in your hand, covered in enemy blood, guaranteed you a seat at the table of the gods. Their weapons reflected generations of metalworking expertise. The Celtic longsword, nearly 3 feet of iron, could split a Roman shield in half with a single overhead blow. Their spears had leaf-shaped bronze tips designed to cause maximum bleeding. Their shields, made from oak planks bound with bronze, were both defensive tools and offensive weapons capable of breaking bones when slammed into an opponent's body. But weapons alone didn't make the Allobroge unstoppable. Their tactical coordination did. Unlike the disorganized barbarian hordes that Romans had fought in central Italy, the Celtic clans fought in tight formations organized by family bonds. Each clan of roughly 2,000 to 3,000 warriors trained together from childhood. They knew each other's movements instinctively. When one clan engaged the enemy, neighboring clans would attack the flanks without needing orders. When a clan needed to withdraw, another would surge forward to cover them. Roman commanders called it the Hydra problem. Every time you defeated one clan, 2 more attacked from different angles. You couldn't break their line because they didn't have a line. They had a living, adaptive organism that responded to threats faster than any commander could issue orders. In 232 BC, Consul Gaius Flaminius led 18,000 legionaries into the Padus Valley. The Allobroge destroyed his army in 4 hours. Flaminius survived, but 11,000 Romans didn't. The following year, Consul Marcus Aemilius tried a different approach. Heavier armor, tighter formations, better defensive positions. The Alabroj killed 9,000 of his 15,000 soldiers and drove the survivors back across the Po River. In 230 BC, the Senate sent both consular armies, nearly 35,000 men, under joint command. The Celts defeated them in detail, destroying one army before the other could arrive to support it. 14,000 Romans died. The survivors limped back to Rome, carrying stories of enemy warriors who fought like men possessed, who seemed to feel no fear, who sang as they killed. The message to Rome was clear. Celtic warriors on Celtic ground could not be beaten using traditional Roman tactics. Something fundamental had to change. Marcus Claudius Marcellus was 43 years old when the Senate appointed him consul and gave him command of the northern campaign. He came from a patrician family, but not one of the great political dynasties that usually monopolized high command. His path to power had been earned through 2 decades of constant warfare, not through family connections or wealth. The scar across his left temple came from a Samnite spear during the brutal mountain campaigns in central Italy. 3 fingers on his right hand were permanently stiff from a sword thrust at the Battle of Sentinum, where Rome had finally broken the coalition of Samnites, Etruscans and Gauls that threatened the Republic's survival. His left shoulder bore the puckered mark of an arrow wound from the Pyrrhic Wars, when King Pyrrhus of Epirus had brought Greek phalanx warfare to Italy and nearly crushed Rome before succumbing to attrition. Each scar represented a lesson. Each wound had taught him something about how men fought and died, about what worked in theory versus what worked when blood was flowing and soldiers were screaming. But his eyes told the real story. Cold and grey, they held the calculating intelligence of a man who treated warfare as a problem to be solved rather than a test of courage. Other Roman commanders spoke of glory and honor. Marcellus spoke of mechanics and mathematics. While his colleagues debated which god to sacrifice to for victory, Marcellus was studying terrain maps and calculating supply requirements. This analytical approach made him unpopular with Rome's traditional military establishment. Warfare, they believed, was about Roman virtue, the willingness to stand face to face with your enemy and prove your superiority through strength and courage. Marcellus thought that was nonsense. Dead Romans were dead, regardless of how virtuously they'd fought. Victory was the only virtue that mattered. He'd spent the winter months before his campaign studying every report from the previous Celtic defeats. He interviewed survivors, asking detailed questions about Celtic tactics. How did they organize their charge? How did they coordinate between clans? What happened when Roman formations held versus when they broke? How long could Celtic warriors maintain their initial fury before exhaustion set in? The pattern became clear. Celtic warfare depended on overwhelming initial impact, followed by sustained coordination between semi-independent units. They expected enemies to meet strength with strength. When opponents stood firm, the Celts would batter them with repeated charges until the line broke. When opponents retreated, the Celts would pursue relentlessly, never allowing formations to reform. Every Roman tactical response had played into Celtic strengths. Standing firm meant absorbing the full force of 50,000 warriors throwing themselves at your shields. Retreating meant being hunted down and slaughtered. The traditional Roman military playbook had no answer to this problem. Marcellus reached a conclusion that would have been heretical to most Roman commanders. Roman military tradition was going to get his entire army killed unless he was willing to abandon it. The question was whether he had the courage to do something no Roman consul had ever done, deliberately reject the tactical wisdom of 500 years of warfare and replace it with the theory that existed only in his head. Standing on the rocky outcrop overlooking the Padus River, watching the massive Celtic camp spread across the valley floor, Marcellus made his decision. He turned to his second in command, Lucius Postumius Albinus, and spoke the words that would change military history. "The old ways are dying, Lucius. We must become something new, or we must die as something old." For 2 centuries, the manipular system had made Roman arms feared throughout the Mediterranean. It was a revolutionary departure from the Greek phalanx. Instead of one rigid block of spearmen, the Romans fought in 3 flexible lines of heavy infantry supported by light troops and cavalry. The first line, the hastati, consisted of younger soldiers in their 20s. They carried 2 piela, weighted javelins, and a short sword called the gladius. Their job was to hit the enemy hard, throw their javelins to disrupt enemy formations, then engage in close combat with swords and shields. Behind them, the principies formed the second line. These were men in their prime, late 20s to mid-30s, equipped identically to the hastati but with more experience and strength. If the hastati couldn't break the enemy, they would fall back through the principes, who would then take over the fight with fresh energy. The third line, the triarii, consisted of the oldest and most experienced soldiers. They fought with long spears rather than swords and served as the last reserve. The Roman saying, "It has come to the triarii," meant the situation was desperate, because if the battle reached the third line, everything else had failed. Each line was divided into maniples, units of about 120 men arranged in a checkerboard pattern. This created flexibility. If one maniple was overwhelmed, others could shift to support it. If the enemy concentrated force in one area, Roman maniples could quickly reinforce that sector. Against the rigid phalanxes of Greek armies, this flexibility was devastating. Against the loosely organized tribal levies of central Italy, it provided overwhelming coordination advantage. But against the Celts, the manipular system was failing for 3 critical reasons. First, the initial javelin throw that usually disrupted enemy formations had minimal effect on Celtic warriors. These men charged forward, expecting to die gloriously. A few hundred casualties from pylon throws didn't slow them down. It enraged them. They would hit the Roman line at full speed with unbroken momentum, smashing into the hastati with the force of a battering ram. Second, the Celtic longswords negated Rome's close combat advantage. The gladius was designed for tight formation fighting, short, stabbing thrusts between shields. But Celtic warriors swung their massive blades in wide arcs that came down from above the Roman shields. A hastatus crouching behind his shield would find a 3-foot iron blade crashing down onto his helmet with bone-crushing force. Roman armor was good, but not good enough to stop a full-strength overhead blow from a 2-handed sword. Third, and most critically, the manipular system's flexibility meant nothing when the enemy wasn't trying to outmaneuver you. The Celts didn't care about flanking movements or tactical positioning. They just kept attacking, clan after clan, wave after wave. When one Roman maniple held firm, the Celts would simply flow around it like water, attacking from 3 sides simultaneously. The checkerboard pattern that gave Romans such advantage against Greeks became a liability. All those gaps between maniples became opportunities for Celtic warriors to penetrate and surround individual units. Albinus had summarized the problem perfectly. These Celts fight like demons. Our maniples break apart under their charge like twigs in a flood. He was right. The manipular system assumed enemies who valued their lives, who would break when casualties mounted, who would retreat when flanked. The Celts valued death in battle above life. They didn't break when casualties mounted. They fought harder. They didn't retreat when flanked. They welcomed being surrounded because it meant more opportunities for glorious combat. Every tactical advantage that had made Rome dominant in Italy was useless against an enemy whose entire culture was built around dying well rather than living well. Marcellus understood this completely. He also understood that the Senate had given him Rome's last available army. If he lost, there were no more legions to send. The Republic would have to abandon all territorial ambitions north of the Po River and accept Celtic dominance of the region for generations. That meant he had one chance to solve a problem that had killed 34,000 Roman soldiers over the previous 3 years. One battle to prove that human intelligence could overcome cultural fanaticism. One afternoon to either validate his theories or join the long list of consuls who had underestimated the Celts and paid with their legions. As he watched the enemy camp that evening, preparing for the Council of War where he would propose his radical new tactics, Marcellus felt the weight of every decision that had brought him to this moment. Tomorrow, he would either save the Republic or destroy it. Marcellus convened his war council 2 hours after sunset. The command tent was lit by oil lamps suspended from wooden posts. their flames casting shifting light across a sand table that dominated the center of the space. The table was 12 feet long and 6 feet wide, carefully sculpted to represent the Padus Valley terrain with precise detail. Every hill, every river bend, every patch of forest marked with colored sand and small wooden markers. 9 men gathered around that table. These weren't politicians playing at generalship. Every man present had commanded troops in actual combat. Every one of them bore scars that told stories of survival when thousands around them had died. Lucius Postumius Albinus stood at Marcellus's right hand. At 51, he was the oldest commander present, a man who had fought in the Pyrrhic Wars when most of the others were still children. His tactical knowledge was encyclopedic. If Albinus thought a plan was sound, the centurions would follow it. If he expressed doubts, the entire command structure would fracture before battle even began. Gaius Claudius Nero, Marcellus's nephew, occupied the opposite side of the table. 28 years old, educated in both Greek military theory and practical Roman warfare, Nero represented the new generation of Roman officers who studied war like scholars studied philosophy. He had read every Greek tactical manual, interviewed veterans of Alexander's campaigns, and spent his own money hiring former Carthaginian officers to explain Hannibal's early victories. Some older officers dismissed him as too intellectual. Marcellus knew better. The young man's mind worked differently than traditional Roman commanders. He saw patterns where others saw chaos. Marcus Junius Brutus commanded the 2nd Legion's Hastati. 30 years of service had left him with a pronounced limp from a shattered hip, a network of scars across both arms, and a reputation for keeping new soldiers alive through their first 3 battles. If any man understood what the Hastati could and couldn't do, it was Brutus. Titus Quinctius Flamininus led the Principes of the 1st Legion. Younger than Brutus but equally experienced, Flamininus had earned his position by saving a broken maniple at the Battle of Maleventum, reorganizing 40 survivors under fire and holding a critical river crossing for 6 hours against overwhelming odds. Gaius Servilius Geminus commanded the Triarii, the old guard, the last line, the men who had seen everything warfare could show a human being, and survived it. At 45, Geminus was missing his left ear, had only partial vision in his right eye, and could quote from memory the tactical dispositions of every major battle Rome had fought in the last 20 years. 3 tribunes completed the council, young nobles serving their mandatory military service before entering political careers, present to observe and learn, but not yet experienced enough to offer meaningful tactical input. Marcellus placed both hands flat on the sand table's edge. Gentlemen, we are here to solve a problem that has killed 34,000 Roman soldiers. I don't want speeches. I don't want appeals to tradition or honor. I want solutions. Brutus, tell them what we're facing. The old centurion stepped forward, using a wooden pointer to indicate positions on the sand table. The Celts organized by clan. Each clan fights as a unit, 2,000 to 3,000 warriors who've trained together since childhood. They don't need officers shouting orders. They know each other's movements instinctively. He moved wooden blocks representing Celtic clans across the sand. When they charge, they don't come at you in one mass. They come in waves, clan by clan, with maybe 50 paces between each wave. The first clan hits your line at full speed. While you're engaged with them, the second clan identifies wherever you're weakest, wherever casualties have thinned your ranks, and they hit that exact spot. The third clan goes for your flanks. Flamininus interrupted. We know how they fight. We need to know how to beat them. I'm explaining why we can't beat them, Brutus replied sharply. Not with current tactics. When we stand firm and meet their charge shield to shield, they batter us with those long swords until our front line breaks. We've tried absorbing their charge and holding. It doesn't work. They're stronger and they don't break morale. When we try to maneuver and outflank them, they just adjust. Each clan operates independently, so there's no central command to disrupt, no formation to outflank. It's like fighting a hydra. Cut off one head, 2 more appear. The tent fell silent. Everyone present had read the reports from previous battles. Everyone knew the fundamental problem. Celtic warfare negated every tactical advantage Rome possessed. Nero spoke quietly from across the table. What if we stop trying to match their strength? What if we use their aggression against them? Albinus turned to face the younger man. Explain. They expect us to meet their charge with resistance. Every enemy they've ever fought has tried to stop them at the point of contact. That's what makes their tactics work. They concentrate force at the collision point and overwhelm it through superior strength and ferocity. Nero reached across the table and rearranged the wooden blocks representing Roman maniples. But what if we don't try to stop them? What if we create deliberate gaps in our formation? Gaps that invite penetration and then close around the warriors who push through. The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from the lamps. Geminus broke the silence. You're describing a tactical retreat. Romans don't retreat. Not a retreat, Nero insisted. Controlled absorption. Think of it like water. When you punch water, your fist goes through. But the water closes around your arm, slowing you, surrounding you, drowning you. Marcellus had been waiting for this moment. His nephew was articulating the theory that had kept Marcellus awake for weeks, the radical concept that violated every principle of Roman military honor, but might, just might, solve the impossible problem of Celtic warfare. Keep talking, Marcellus commanded. Nero moved around the table, his hands gesturing rapidly as the concept took shape. Our whole tactical system is built on flexibility. The manipular formation gives us the ability to adapt to any situation, but we're using that flexibility defensively to maintain formation integrity under pressure. What if we used it offensively? He began rearranging the wooden blocks on the sand table, creating patterns that made the older officers shift uncomfortably. Current formation, 3 lines, each line divided into maniples arranged in checkerboard pattern. The gaps between maniples in the first line are covered by maniples in the second line. Standard, proven, effective against phalanxes and tribal levies. His hands moved the blocks into a new configuration. New formation. The hastati are arranged in clusters with deliberately widened gaps between them. Not gaps we're trying to cover, gaps we want the enemy to enter. The principes are positioned not directly behind the hastati, but offset to the sides. Of those gaps, the triarii are divided into smaller mobile units positioned in reserve, ready to move rapidly to any point on the battlefield. Brutus leaned forward, studying the arrangement. You're inviting the enemy to break through our front line. Exactly, Nero confirmed. The Celts charge. Our hastati engaged them just long enough to slow their momentum and disrupt their formation. Then the hastati yield ground, falling back through the gaps in a controlled withdrawal. The Celtic warriors, seeing what they think is a collapsing Roman line, surge forward into those gaps. He moved enemy blocks into the spaces between Roman positions. But when they push through, they don't find a broken army fleeing in panic. They find themselves inside a killing zone. Principes on both flanks, triarii moving to cut off their retreat. They're surrounded, compressed, unable to use their longswords effectively because they're packed too tightly together. Flamininus traced the movements with his finger. And while we're destroying the first wave that penetrated our lines, the second wave is doing what? Waiting politely? The second wave sees the first wave disappearing into our formation, Nero replied. They can't see that we're destroying their warriors. They just see the battle moving deeper into our lines. Their instinct is to follow, to support their brothers. So they charge into the same gaps. We repeat the process. Until when? Albinus asked. Until we run out of room to maneuver. Until our soldiers are too exhausted to keep fighting. This requires an enormous amount of coordination under conditions of absolute chaos. Marcellus finally spoke. It requires discipline. Perfect discipline. Every maniple must trust that the others will do their part. If the hastati panic and run instead of executing a controlled withdrawal, the formation collapses. If the principes engage too early or too late, we lose the encirclement. If the triarii don't move quickly enough to cut off retreat, the trapped Celts can fight their way back out. Exactly, Albinus said, his voice carrying an edge. "You're asking Hastati, young soldiers in their first or second campaign, to hold position while enemy warriors charge at them, then to deliberately yield ground in perfect order while those same warriors are trying to kill them. You're asking them to override every survival instinct, every piece of training they've received about holding the line." Geminus added his own concerns. "And you're asking the Triarii to abandon their traditional role as the anchored reserve. We've been the rock at the center of the Roman line for 200 years. Now you want us racing around the battlefield like cavalry?" Marcellus met each man's eyes in turn. "I'm asking you to win. That's all. Previous tactics have failed. The Senate has given us the last available army. If we fight the way Rome has always fought, we will lose the way Rome has lost 3 times before. What I'm proposing is untested, dangerous, and contrary to every tradition we hold sacred." He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. "But it gives us a chance. The Celts have never faced an enemy who deliberately allowed penetration and then converted it into encirclement. Their entire tactical doctrine assumes that enemies will try to stop their charge. We're going to do something they can't prepare for because they can't imagine it." Brutus drummed his scarred fingers on the table's edge. "The Hastati will need explicit instructions on exactly how far to yield, exactly when to disengage, exactly where to regroup. This can't be left to individual judgment in the chaos of battle." "Agreed," Marcellus said. "We spend tomorrow drilling the movements, not full maniples. That would show the enemy our intentions. But centurions and optiones need to understand the timing precisely. They drill their men on individual components without explaining the full tactical picture until the morning of battle." Flamininus raised another concern. "Distance between the Hastati clusters. Too wide, and the Celts will just flow around them entirely, ignoring our front line and hitting the Principes directly. Too narrow, and we don't channel enough enemy warriors into the kill zones." 40 paces between cluster centers, Nero suggested. "Wide enough to invite penetration, narrow enough that the Principes can cover the flanks of the gaps without being spread too thin." The discussion continued deep into the night, calculating precise distances, determining rally points for withdrawing Hastati, establishing signals for Triarii movement, identifying what could go catastrophically wrong, and building contingencies for each failure point. This was the unglamorous reality of military innovation. Not brilliant flashes of insight, but hours of grinding detailed planning. How many steps should the Hastati retreat before reforming? Which centurion would be responsible for timing the Principes' flanking movement? What happens if a cluster of Hastati gets completely overrun before they can withdraw? By midnight, the sand table showed a complete tactical system unlike anything in Roman military history. Marcellus had the tribunes record every detail on wax tablets while it was fresh in everyone's mind. The Hastati would deploy in 16 clusters of roughly 300 men each, arranged in 2 staggered rows. Each cluster would occupy a frontage of approximately 60 paces, with 40-pace gaps between clusters. Total frontage, just under a mile, which matched the valley terrain where the battle would occur. When the Celtic charge began, each Hastati cluster would throw their pilot at 50 paces, not to break the enemy charge, but to mark the distance for their own withdrawal. After releasing javelins, they would engage for exactly a count of 100 heartbeats. Centurions would literally count, keeping time while fighting. At the signal, 3 short trumpet blasts, the Hastati would execute a fighting withdrawal, not a rout, not a panicked retreat. A controlled, organized movement backward through predetermined gaps in the Principes line. Officers would physically push men into position if necessary. Anyone who broke formation and ran would be executed after the battle, assuming Rome won. The Principes were the key to making the entire system work. They would deploy in offset positions, each Principes maniple positioned to cover the gap between 2 Hastati clusters. When the Hastati withdrew through their lines, the Principes would immediately close ranks, forming a wall on both sides of the gap where Celtic warriors were now penetrating. The trapped Celts would find themselves in a corridor roughly 40 paces wide and 60 paces deep, with Roman heavy infantry on both sides and their own warriors pressing in from behind. The long swords that gave Celts such advantage in open battle became liabilities in confined spaces. You need room to swing a 3-foot blade. Compressed into tight quarters, Celtic warriors would be reduced to shoving and grappling, while Roman gladii, designed specifically for close quarters stabbing, did efficient, brutal work. The triarii would function as the mobile crisis response. Geminus divided his 1,000 triarii into 10 units of 100 men each. These units would be positioned in a third line, roughly 200 paces behind the principes. Their job was to move to wherever the situation was most critical, cutting off retreat routes for trapped Celts, reinforcing any principes maniples that were being overwhelmed, or responding to unexpected Celtic tactical adjustments. Cavalry and light infantry would protect the flanks and prevent the Celts from simply going around the entire formation. This was standard Roman tactical doctrine, but it assumed new importance. If Celtic clans managed to turn the Roman flanks, the entire intricate formation would collapse into chaos. The plan had one massive vulnerability that everyone recognized, but nobody wanted to say aloud. It required the Hastati to execute a controlled withdrawal while being attacked by warriors whose entire culture celebrated dying in combat. Young soldiers who had been trained their entire careers to hold formation, to never yield ground, to view retreat as the ultimate dishonor. These men would need to deliberately fall back while Celtic warriors charged at them screaming. If even a few maniples panicked and broke, the contagion could spread through the entire first line. Once one unit fled for real, others would follow. The whole system would disintegrate. Marcellus addressed this directly. The Hastati will be terrified. That's not a problem to solve. It's a fact to accept. Fear doesn't make soldiers useless. Uncontrolled fear does. So we give them something to control. He looked at Brutus. Your centurions will drill the withdrawal movement tomorrow until the men can do it in their sleep. Make it mechanical. Make it so automatic that their bodies execute the movements without their minds having to think. Fear lives in the mind. We're going to put the withdrawal sequence into their muscles. Brutus nodded slowly. We tell them it's a new formation drill. Don't explain why. Don't mention the battle plan, just drill the movement. Advance 20 paces, plant feet, engage for a count of 50, withdraw 15 paces, reform, repeat. Exactly, Marcellus confirmed. When the actual battle comes and we give the signal to withdraw, their bodies will already know what to do. The movement will feel familiar even if the circumstances are terrifying. Nero raised one final concern. We're assuming the Celts will charge directly into our formation, but what if they recognize what we're doing? What if they refuse to enter the gaps and instead try to envelop our flanks? Then we've learned something about our enemy that we didn't know before, Marcellus replied. And we adapt. But I don't think they will. Celtic culture doesn't value tactical caution. They value courage, aggression, commitment. When they see gaps in our line, they'll view it as weakness to be exploited, not as a trap. Their entire worldview is built on the idea that the brave warrior who charges fearlessly will triumph. We're going to use that belief to destroy them. Albinus, who had remained largely silent for the last hour, finally offered his judgment. This plan violates every tactical principle I learned in 30 years of warfare. It asks our soldiers to do things that contradict their training and their instincts. The margin for error is almost non-existent. He paused, studying the sand table one more time. It's also the first plan I've heard that might actually work. The Celts can't be beaten by meeting strength with strength. We've proven that 3 times, so we have to beat them with something they've never encountered. This qualifies. Marcellus felt the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. If Albinus supported the plan, the other commanders would follow. Not enthusiastically perhaps, but they would follow. Tomorrow we drill, Marcellus announced. The day after, we offer battle. Dismissed. As the officers filed out of the command tent into the cold night, Nero lingered behind. Uncle, if this works, we'll change how Rome fights forever. Marcellus looked at the sand table, at the wooden blocks representing 28,000 human lives depending on his judgment. And if it fails, someone else will have to figure out how to beat the Celts, because we'll all be dead. The sun had barely risen when Marcellus walked through the camp the morning after the war council. He moved alone, without the usual escort of tribunes and messengers, wanting to see his army without the filter of official reports and command hierarchies. The Roman military camp was a marvel of systematic organization. Every tent stood in precisely measured rows. Every sentry occupied its designated position. Water sources, latrines, supply wagons, smithing stations, all positioned according to regulations, established through centuries of campaign experience. A Roman soldier could wake up in darkness in unfamiliar territory and still know exactly where everything was, because every camp followed the identical layout. This systematic approach extended to every aspect of military life. Soldiers woke at the same hour every morning. They ate the same meals at the same times. They performed the same maintenance routines on their equipment. The relentless repetition wasn't meant to crush individuality. It was meant to create automatic responses that would function even when fear and exhaustion destroyed conscious thought. In the Hastati section, Marcellus observed young soldiers conducting pre-battle equipment inspections. Marcus Antonius, a 17-year-old from the Subura slums of Rome, carefully checked each link in his chainmail shirt. He'd saved for 2 years to buy that armor. Quality chainmail cost 6 months' wages for a laborer. His family had contributed what little they could, hoping the armor would keep their son alive long enough to earn the combat pay that might lift them out of poverty. Antonius's pilum leaned against his tent. The weapon represented Roman military innovation at its finest. The wooden shaft was 6 feet long, topped with a 2-foot iron shank that tapered to a pyramid-shaped point. The genius was in the design of that iron shank. It was deliberately made from soft iron that would bend on impact. When a pilum struck an enemy shield, the iron shank would penetrate the wood and then bend from the weight of the wooden shaft. Suddenly, the enemy warrior was carrying a 6-foot wooden pole hanging from his shield, making it nearly impossible to use effectively. He'd have to either drop the shield or stop fighting long enough to tear the pilum free, and those seconds of vulnerability were when Roman gladii did their killing work. Even if a pilum missed its target and hit the ground, enemies couldn't pick it up and throw it back because the bent shank made it useless as a projectile. Every detail served a tactical purpose. Gaius Valerius Maximus, a 32-year-old Principes from the 2nd Legion, sat outside his tent, methodically sharpening his gladius. The short sword was only 2 feet long, ridiculously small compared to Celtic longswords, but in close formation, fighting, length was a liability. The gladius was designed for repeated stabbing thrusts between shields, aimed at bellies and throats where armor was weakest. Maximus had been with the legions for 11 years. His wife had died in childbirth during his 3rd campaign, leaving him with a daughter being raised by his sister in Rome. He sent most of his pay back to support them, keeping only enough to maintain his equipment and occasionally get drunk enough to forget what he'd seen in battle. He knew the rumors spreading through camp that tomorrow's battle would involve new tactics, that the consul was planning something unconventional. The older soldiers didn't like it. Roman military tradition said you stood your ground and traded blows until one side broke. You didn't get clever. Cleverness was what Greeks did, and everyone knew Greeks couldn't match Romans in straight combat. But Maximus had survived 11 years by trusting his officers and following orders exactly. If the consul said to advance, you advanced. If he said to hold, you held. That discipline was what separated Roman soldiers from barbarian warriors who fought like individual heroes. Across the camp in the Triarii section, Lucius Cornelius Sulla adjusted the straps on his greaves. At 41, Sulla was among the oldest combat soldiers in the army. The Triarii were called the Old Guard for good reason. You didn't reach the 3rd line unless you'd survived at least 15 years of constant warfare. Sulla fought with a long spear rather than a gladius. In traditional Roman tactics, the Triarii formed the anchored reserve. If battle reached them, it meant the Hastati and Principes had both failed. The Triarii would plant their spears and create an immovable wall that either held or died in place. The saying, "It has come to the Triarii," meant a desperate situation, because the Old Guard was your last hope. But the whispers Sulla heard suggested tomorrow would be different. The triarii wouldn't be an anchored reserve. They'd be divided into mobile units responding to threats across the battlefield. It was strange, uncomfortable. But Sulla trusted Geminus, his centurion, and Geminus seemed to support whatever the consul was planning. Marcellus watched these men and the 28,000 others like them preparing for battle. Each soldier represented a family's hope, a community's investment, a life full of experiences and relationships and dreams. Tomorrow, thousands of them would die. That was the arithmetic of warfare. The question was whether their deaths would purchase victory or simply add to the list of failed Roman campaigns against the Celts. The weight of command meant understanding that every tactical decision translated into specific human consequences. If Marcellus ordered the Hastati to hold position too long during their withdrawal, dozens of young men like Antonius would be cut down by Celtic swords. If he ordered them to withdraw too early, the Celts wouldn't commit deeply enough to the trap, and the entire tactical plan would fail. Numbers on a sand table, wooden blocks representing maniples. Clean, abstract, manageable. But here in the camp, those abstractions had faces and names and families waiting for them to return home. By mid-morning, the centurions had begun drilling their men in the new movement patterns. The soldiers didn't know they were rehearsing tomorrow's battle plan. They thought it was just another formation exercise. Quintus Fabius Maximus, a centurion, commanding a Hastati century, walked his men through the sequence for the 5th time. Advance 20 paces, plant your feet, hold position. I'm counting, so don't move until I signal. Good, now controlled withdrawal, 15 paces back, maintain formation, watch your intervals. The young soldiers executed the movements with increasing precision. Muscle memory was developing. When battle came and fear flooded their minds, their bodies would remember these drills and execute automatically. But not all the soldiers accepted the changes without question. During a rest break, a group of Hastati gathered around their centurion with concerns. "Sir," one asked, "why are we drilling withdrawals? Romans don't retreat." Fabius had anticipated this question. "Romans adapt. Every drill you perform makes you more capable of responding to battlefield conditions. Stop thinking and start doing what you're told." But the questions reflected a deeper cultural anxiety. Roman military identity was built on the concept of disciplina, unwavering commitment to formation, integrity, and collective action. Retreat, even controlled retreat, felt like a violation of something sacred. That afternoon, Marcus Tullius Cicero, the young military tribune, approached Marcellus with a delegation of concerned soldiers. They were respectful, proper in their military bearing, but clearly troubled. "Sir, the men are asking about tomorrow's formation. Some of the more experienced soldiers are worried about the new tactics." Marcellus had expected this conversation. Worried how? "They've been trained to hold their ground. The idea that we might deliberately allow the enemy to penetrate our lines." Cicero hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "It challenges their understanding of what it means to fight as Romans." "Their understanding is incomplete," Marcellus replied. "Roman military excellence isn't about rigid adherence to specific tactics. It's about winning. We've lost 3 times against these Celts using traditional methods. Tradition that gets you killed is just a slower form of suicide." But he understood their fear. These men had been raised on stories of Roman courage, of legions that held their ground against overwhelming odds, of soldiers who died in formation rather than yield a single step. Now their consul was asking them to abandon those values. "Gather the centurions," Marcellus commanded, "all of them. It's time they understood what we're actually doing tomorrow." 2 hours later, nearly 200 centurions assembled in the camp's central area. These were the backbone of Roman military power. Professional soldiers who had earned their positions through merit, whose tactical decisions in combat often determined victory or defeat. Marcellus studied their faces. Some were eager, ready to trust his leadership. Others were skeptical, waiting to be convinced. A few were openly hostile, viewing any departure from tradition as weakness. He needed all of them, committed. A centurion who doubted the plan would communicate that doubt to his men, and doubt was as contagious as plague in an army facing battle. Marcellus stepped onto a raised platform so every centurion could see him clearly. He didn't begin with appeals to glory or honor. He began with truth. Tomorrow, we face an enemy that outnumbers us nearly 2-1. They fight on ground they know, with weapons they have mastered, supported by beliefs that make them willing, eager to die in battle. By every conventional measure, we should lose. The assembled centurions stirred. Roman commanders didn't typically start pre-battle speeches by cataloguing enemy advantages. But we are not a conventional army, Marcellus continued, his voice carrying clearly across the crowd. We are the inheritors of 5 centuries of military evolution. Every battle our fathers fought, every defeat they suffered, every victory they won, all of it has brought us to this moment. We stand on the accumulated knowledge of generations who learned how to fight better than anyone else in the world. He paused, letting that settle. The Celts expect us to fight the way Romans have always fought, shield to shield, sword to sword, strength against strength. They have prepared for that battle. In that battle, they would likely prevail. Their warriors are individually stronger, culturally committed to dying gloriously, and perfectly adapted to close-quarters combat with those massive swords. The honesty was deliberate. Marcellus wasn't going to insult their intelligence by pretending the enemy was weak. So we will not fight that battle. We will fight a battle our enemies cannot imagine. We will use their strength as the instrument of their destruction. We will be like water that seems to yield, but which carves through stone, given time and patience. Gaius Marius, a young centurion whose tactical thinking had impressed Marcellus during planning sessions, stepped forward. Sir, what you're describing requires absolute trust between units. If any maniple breaks formation and runs for real instead of executing the controlled withdrawal, then we all die, Marcellus acknowledged. But if we maintain our discipline, if we trust in each other and in the plan, we become something our enemies have never faced. We become impossible to defeat using their methods. He gestured toward the enemy camp visible in the distance. Those warriors believe courage and individual prowess win battles. They're wrong. Coordination wins battles. Discipline wins battles. The ability to execute complex tactics under conditions of absolute chaos wins battles. And those are Roman virtues. Marcellus moved to the edge of the platform, his voice dropping but somehow carrying even further. Tomorrow, I'm asking the Hastati to do something that feels wrong. I'm asking them to yield ground while being attacked. Every instinct will scream at them to hold position. They'll feel like cowards. They'll think they're abandoning their brothers. He looked directly at the centurions commanding Hastati centuries. Your job is to make them understand that controlled withdrawal isn't cowardice. It's discipline in its purest form. Any fool can stand in place and get killed. It takes a Roman soldier to execute tactical movements while enemy warriors are trying to split his skull. That's not weakness. That's strength they cannot comprehend. The centurions were listening now, really listening. The principes will have to trust that the Hastati will withdraw through their lines without causing chaos. The Triarii will have to abandon 2 centuries of doctrine and become mobile instead of anchored. Everyone will have to do something new, something untested, something that feels dangerous. Marcellus's voice hardened. And everyone will do it exactly as ordered, because that's what separates us from every other army in the world. We don't just follow orders when they're comfortable. We follow orders when they're terrifying. We maintain discipline when discipline is the only thing standing between us and annihilation. He swept his gaze across the assembled centurions. The Celts are brave, they're strong, they're willing to die for their gods and their honor. But bravery without coordination is just noise. Strength without system is just wasted effort. They'll charge at us tomorrow, like they've charged at every enemy they've ever faced, expecting us to meet courage with courage. Marcellus smiled grimly. Instead, we'll meet their courage with intelligence, their strength with flexibility. their heroism with systematic destruction. And when the sun sets tomorrow, they'll understand that the age of individual warriors has ended. The age of disciplined systems has begun. The silence that followed was absolute. Tell your men, Marcellus concluded, that tomorrow they won't just be fighting for Rome. They'll be proving that human beings can overcome any natural disadvantage through organization and thought. The Celts were born to this kind of warfare. We're choosing to master it anyway. That makes us more dangerous than they can possibly understand. He stepped down from the platform. The centurions stood motionless for a moment, processing what they'd heard. Then, without any command being given, they saluted in unison, the sharp crack of fists against chest armor echoing across the camp. They believed, or at least they were willing to trust. Tomorrow would determine whether that trust was justified or whether Marcellus had just delivered a brilliant speech before leading them all to pointless death. Dawn arrived cold and grey over the Padus Valley. Mist clung to the river like a living thing, reducing visibility to less than 200 paces. Marcus Antonius stood in formation with his Hastati century, feeling the weight of his chainmail pressing down on his shoulders and the slick dampness of his palms inside his leather gloves. Around him, 2,700 other Hastati stood in their assigned clusters. The formation looked wrong to anyone familiar with traditional Roman tactics. Instead of continuous lines of heavy infantry, there were distinct groups separated by gaps wide enough to march a cart through. Antonius had drilled the withdrawal movement yesterday until his legs ached, but he still didn't understand why they'd practiced retreating. Romans didn't retreat. Across the valley, the Celtic war horns began their morning call. The sound was nothing like Roman military trumpets. It was deeper, older, a resonance that seemed to come from the earth itself, rather than from bronze instruments. The first time Antonius had heard that sound, 3 days ago when the armies first sighted each other, his bowels had turned to water. Now he just gripped his pilum tighter and tried to control his breathing. The mist began to thin as the sun climbed higher. Through the drifting grey, Antonius caught his first clear view of the Celtic host. 50,000 warriors occupied the opposite side of the valley. They weren't arranged in neat Roman-style formations. There was no geometric precision, no measured intervals between units. Instead, they clustered by clan, each group marked by different coloured shields and different patterns of war paint on their bodies. The royal clan held the centre position, 3,000 elite warriors whose bronze torques gleamed even in the weak morning light. These were men who had killed in single combat, who had earned the right to wear the sacred neck rings of proven fighters. Their war chief Brennus stood head and shoulders above his companions, a massive figure carrying a two-handed sword that looked capable of splitting a man from shoulder to hip. On the flanks, the younger warriors of the subordinate clans bounced on their toes and beat their spears against their shields in rhythmic patterns. They were working themselves into the battle fury that Celtic culture called the warp spasm, a state of ecstatic rage where pain became meaningless and death became glorious. Gaius Valerius Maximus, standing with the Principes 200 paces behind Antonius, watched the Celtic preparations with the detached analytical focus that came from 11 years of combat experience. He'd fought Samnites, Greeks, and Carthaginians. He'd seen men die in every way warfare could devise. But there was something uniquely terrifying about facing an enemy whose entire culture celebrated dying in battle. The Celts weren't trying to survive. They were trying to die well. That made them unpredictable and extraordinarily dangerous. Behind the Principes, Lucius Cornelius Sulla stood with his triary unit. 100 men equipped with long spears and positioned for rapid movement rather than anchored defense. At 41, Sulla had seen enough battles to know when something fundamental was changing. Today's formation violated every principle of triarii doctrine, but Geminus, his centurion, had explained it simply. We're not the last line anymore. We're the mobile response. When things go wrong, and they will, we fix them. Marcellus observed the deployment from a command position on elevated ground 200 paces behind his army. From here, he could see the entire battlefield. The staggered Hastati clusters, the offset principes waiting in support, the divided triarii ready to respond to threats. On the sand table in his command tent, the formation had looked elegant and logical. Here on actual ground with actual human lives at stake, it looked fragile and exposed. Albinus stood beside him, studying the Celtic army through experienced eyes. They're going to hit us hard. Royal clan in the center, which means Brennus himself will be in the first wave. Good, Marcellus replied. If we can trap and kill him in the initial encirclement, the subordinate clans might lose cohesion. Or they might fight harder to avenge him. Then we kill them too. The Celtic war horns sounded again, 3 long, mournful notes that rolled across the valley like thunder. The attack signal. 50,000 warriors began to move. The Celtic advance started slowly, almost ceremonially. The royal clan moved first, Brennus at their center, walking forward with their massive swords resting on their shoulders. They chanted something in their own language, a war song or prayer, impossible to tell which. Behind them, the subordinate clans began their own advance, maintaining the 50-pace interval that Roman intelligence had identified as their standard tactical spacing. At 100 paces, the chanting stopped. At 75 paces, the walk became a jog. At 50 paces, the jog became a sprint. The sound of 50,000 men charging at full speed was indescribable. The thunder of feet striking ground, the crash of weapons beating against shields, the rising howl of voices raised in battle cries that hadn't changed in 1,000 years. The ground itself seemed to shake. "Release!" shouted Quintus Fabius Maximus, the Hastati centurion. 2,700 piula flew through the air in near-perfect unison. The weighted javelins traced dark arcs against the grey sky before plunging down into the charging Celtic mass. The pylon wasn't designed for accuracy. It was designed for disruption. Where they struck shields, the iron shanks punched through wood and then bent, making the shields unusable. Where they struck flesh, they created wounds that bled quickly and didn't heal cleanly. The pylon volley killed perhaps 200 Celtic warriors and wounded 3 times that many. Against most armies, 800 casualties before contact would have slowed the charge, created hesitation. The Celts didn't even pause. Brennus himself had a pylon embedded in his shield. Rather than dropping the now unwieldy shield, he simply tore it off his arm and threw it aside, choosing to fight without protection rather than waste time removing the javelin. Dozens of other warriors did the same. They crashed into the Hastati line like a wave hitting a seawall. Marcus Antonius felt the impact through his entire body, the shock of a 200-pound warrior hitting his shield at full sprint. His feet slid backward 6 inches before he managed to brace himself. The Celtic warrior facing him was older, maybe 30, with intricate blue spirals painted across his chest and arms. He swung his long sword in a massive overhead arc aimed at splitting Antonius's helmet. Antonius got his shield up in time. The sword bit deep into the wood, so deep the warrior needed 2 seconds to wrench it free. Antonius used those seconds to thrust his gladius forward in a short, sharp stab aimed at the man's belly. The Celtic warrior twisted aside, and the blade scored a bloody line across his ribs instead of disemboweling him. All along the Hastati line, similar exchanges played out thousands of times simultaneously. The Celts had the advantage in reach and individual strength. Their long swords could strike from angles the shorter gladius couldn't match. But the Hastati had superior armor and the discipline to maintain formation even under assault. Quintus Fabius Maximus counted heartbeats while fighting: 73, 81, 94. The count was almost mechanical, separate from the part of his brain managing combat. At 100, he shouted the command he'd drilled into his men the previous day: "Controlled withdrawal, execute!" The 3 short trumpet blasts followed immediately. All along the Hastati line, centurions repeated the order. And 2,700 young soldiers did something that violated every combat instinct they possessed. They stepped backward while enemy warriors were trying to kill them. Antonius felt his centurion's hand on his shoulder, physically guiding him backward. "Move! 15 paces! Maintain intervals!" He stepped back. The Celtic warrior facing him surged forward, seeing what looked like Roman cowardice, Roman weakness. Antonius kept his shield up and continued the controlled retreat, counting steps. 5, 8, 12, 15. "Reform!" Fabius shouted. The Hastati cluster locked shields again, but they were now 60 paces behind their original position. The gap between their cluster and the adjacent clusters had widened from 40 paces to nearly 80. And into those gaps poured 3,000 Celtic warriors, Brennus himself at their lead, seeing what they believed was a collapsing Roman formation. The trap was set. Gaius Valerius Maximus watched the Celtic royal clan surge through the gaps in the Hastati line, their war cries echoing across the valley. They thought they were pursuing a broken enemy. They thought victory was within reach. They were wrong. "Principes, close formation, now." The command came from Tribune Nero, positioned to coordinate the second-line response. Maximus and the 1,100 other Principes who had been waiting in offset positions moved forward in perfect unison. They didn't charge. They marched, shields locked, maintaining the disciplined advance that was the hallmark of Roman infantry. Within 30 seconds, they had closed the gaps on both sides of the Celtic penetration. Brennus and his royal guard found themselves in a corridor roughly 60 paces wide and 80 paces deep, Romans on both flanks. Their own warriors pressing in from behind, still surging forward because they couldn't see what was happening at the front of the charge. The Celtic war chief recognized the trap instantly. His eyes widened, not with fear, but with something approaching respect. Then he raised his massive sword and roared a challenge in his own language. The royal clan attacked the Roman Principes on both sides of the corridor simultaneously. These weren't the young Hastati they'd been fighting moments before. These were men in their prime, in their late 20s and early 30s, equipped with the same armor but carrying years more experience. Maximus found himself facing 2 Celtic warriors at once. The confined space that was supposed to neutralize the Celts' long swords didn't completely eliminate the advantage. Not when the warriors were skilled enough to coordinate their attacks. One feinted high while the other went low. Maximus blocked the high strike with his shield and had to trust his greaves to deflect the low thrust. The bronze shin guard saved his life. The Celtic blade scored across the metal with a screech but didn't penetrate. Maximus riposted with a gladius thrust that caught the low attacker in the throat. The man went down, blood spraying across Maximus's armor. The second warrior swung again, a horizontal cut aimed at Maximus's neck. Maximus ducked and felt the sword pass inches above his helmet. Before the Celtic warrior could recover, the Principes next to Maximus, a man named Titus whom Maximus had known for 6 years, thrust his gladius into the warrior's armpit, where the armor coverage was minimal. The Celt died without making a sound. This was Roman warfare at its most efficient. No individual heroics, no elaborate duels. Just systematic mutual support, where every soldier protected the men beside him and trusted them to return the favor. But the Celts were holding their own despite being trapped. Their cultural commitment to glorious death meant they fought with absolute commitment, no thoughts of retreat or surrender. And there were 3,000 of them compressed into a space designed to hold maybe 1,000 comfortably. The Triarii moved. Sulla's century of 100 men ran forward at the double-quick pace, their long spears held at the ready. Their target wasn't the Celtic warriors already engaged with the Principes. It was the rear of the Celtic formation, where warriors were still pressing forward, unaware that their leading elements were trapped. "Form barrier!" Geminus commanded. The Triarii spread into a line 2 men deep, their spears creating a wall of iron points. Any Celtic warrior who tried to push deeper into Roman lines would have to go through that barrier first. And behind them, 2 more Triarii centuries were moving to execute the same maneuver on the other side of the penetration. Within 3 minutes of the initial Celtic charge, Marcellus's tactical innovation had converted what looked like a breaking Roman line into a systematic killing zone. The Celtic royal clan was surrounded on 3 sides, Principes on the flanks, Triarii blocking the rear. They could move forward toward the reformed Hastati, but the Hastati had closed ranks and stood ready to receive them. They could try to break through the principes or triarii, but that meant fighting through fresh Roman heavy infantry with nowhere to maneuver. And the subordinate clans still coming forward in their staggered waves couldn't see what was happening. All they saw was the royal clan disappearing into Roman lines, which they interpreted as successful penetration. So they charged into the same gaps, following their brothers into the trap. The second wave, roughly 8,000 warriors from 3 different clans, hit the reformed Hastati line and surged through the gaps exactly as the royal clan had done. The Hastati executed the same controlled withdrawal. The Principes closed the flanks, the Triarii blocked the rear. Now there were 11,000 Celtic warriors trapped in killing zones across multiple points on the battlefield, compressed so tightly they could barely swing their weapons, while Roman gladi did efficient, terrible work in the close quarters. Tribune Nero, observing from a command position, felt something close to awe at watching theory translate into reality. The plan was working exactly as designed. The Celts' greatest strength, their willingness to charge fearlessly into any gap, had become the instrument of their destruction. But battles weren't won by plans. They were won by soldiers executing plans under impossible conditions. And even trapped, the Celts were proving extraordinarily difficult to kill. Brennus had lost count of how many Romans he'd killed. 6, 8, it didn't matter. What mattered was that he understood something about this battle that most of his warriors didn't yet grasp. They were going to lose. The realization didn't fill him with despair. Celtic culture didn't view death in battle as tragedy. It was the highest honor a warrior could achieve. But Brennus was war chief of the royal clan, and he had responsibilities beyond simply dying well. He needed to create an opportunity for the survivors to escape and rebuild. He rallied the 200 warriors still standing near him, the core of his elite guard, men who had followed him for a decade, who trusted his judgment absolutely. "We go forward," he shouted in Celtic. "Through the center, break their line and the whole formation collapses." It was tactically sound. The Hastati ahead of them had already withdrawn once. If Brennus could smash through them completely, the Principes would be forced to abandon their flanking positions to prevent a total breakthrough. That would open escape routes for the trapped warriors. Brennus charged. The Hastati line saw him coming, 7 feet of muscle and fury, covered in Roman blood, swinging a sword that weighed as much as a man's leg. Young Marcus Antonius was directly in the war chief's path. For one frozen second, Antonius looked into Brennus's eyes and saw his own death approaching. Then Quintus Fabius Maximus stepped in front of him. The centurion took Brennus's charge on his shield, the impact driving him backward 3 steps. The Celtic sword came down in an overhead blow that would have split Fabius's head if it had connected. Fabius angled his shield at the last instant, deflecting the blade just enough that it slammed into his shoulder instead of his skull. The chainmail held, but Fabius felt his collarbone snap. Pain exploded through his shoulder and arm. His shield dropped 6 inches. Brennus reversed his grip for a thrust that would punch through Fabius's weakened defense and into his chest. 3 Pila hit the Celtic war chief simultaneously. The Hastati behind Fabius had switched to their backup javelins. At a range of 10 paces, even hastily thrown, Pila carried enormous force. The iron shanks punched through Brennus's chest, 1 on the left side just below the ribs, 2 on the right side higher up near his shoulder. Brennus staggered but didn't fall. He looked down at the iron shafts protruding from his body with an expression of mild surprise, as if the wounds belonged to someone else. Then he raised his sword again, determined to kill at least 1 more Roman before he died. Marcus Antonius stepped around his wounded centurion and thrust his gladius into Brennus's throat. The Celtic war chief dropped to his knees, blood pouring from his neck wound to mix with the blood flowing from his chest. He tried to speak. Whether it was a curse or a prayer, Antonius would never know. Then Brennus fell forward, his massive sword slipping from fingers that could no longer grip it. The royal clan saw their war chief fall. A wail went up from 2,000 throats. Rage and grief mixed into a sound that made Roman blood run cold. But the wail didn't lead to collapse or surrender. It led to redoubled fury. The elite warriors threw themselves at the Roman lines with complete abandon, no longer trying to break through, simply trying to kill as many enemies as possible before joining their chief in death. The Roman formation absorbed the assault and systematically ground the Celtic warriors down. This was what Roman military discipline was designed for, not brilliant tactical maneuvers, but the grim, bloody business of killing brave men who refused to stop fighting. It took another hour to destroy the royal clan completely. Of the 3,000 warriors who had charged through the Hastati gaps, fewer than 200 survived to be taken prisoner. The rest died in the killing zones, buried under piles of their own dead, fighting until Roman gladi or spears ended their resistance. By noon, the Battle of Pardus was effectively over. The subordinate Celtic clans, seeing the systematic destruction of the royal clan and the next two waves that had followed them into the trap, finally recognized what was happening. The Roman formation wasn't breaking. It was designed to allow penetration and then convert it into encirclement. Roughly 15,000 Celtic warriors fled north toward the Alps, carrying news of a new kind of Roman warfare that couldn't be defeated with traditional courage and strength. Another 5,000 surrendered when Roman cavalry cut off their escape routes. The remaining 30,000 lay dead across a battlefield that stretched for nearly 2 miles. Roman casualties numbered 3,800 dead and another 6,000 wounded. The casualty ratio, nearly 8 Celtic dead for every Roman killed, was unprecedented in warfare between civilized armies and tribal forces. But numbers didn't capture the human cost. Quintus Fabius Maximus would never regain full use of his left arm. Marcus Antonius would wake up screaming from nightmares about Brennus's eyes for the next 20 years. Gaius Valerius Maximus had watched Titus, his friend for 6 years, take a Celtic sword to the face in the final minutes of fighting, dying instantly when he could have survived if he'd just stepped back one pace. As burial details began, the grim work of separating Roman from Celtic dead, Marcellus walked through the battlefield with Albinus. The systematic efficiency of Roman military organization extended even to this. Bodies were identified by their equipment, names recorded, personal effects collected to be returned to families. The Celts would be cremated in mass pyres, their ashes scattered according to their own customs as explained by prisoners. "It worked," Albinus said quietly, surveying the carnage. "Your plan worked exactly as you said it would." Marcellus knelt beside the body of a young Hastatus. Not Marcus Antonius, who had survived, but someone else. Someone whose name Marcellus didn't know. The soldier was maybe 18 years old, his face still smooth and unlined, frozen in an expression of surprise. He'd probably never seen combat before today. "Did it work?" Marcellus asked. "We won the battle. We'll control the Padus Valley. The Senate will celebrate and declare me a hero. But this boy is still dead. So are 3,700 others. What exactly did we win that was worth their lives?" Albinus didn't have an answer. Nobody did. Victory in war always cost more than it should, and the bills were always paid by young men who had their whole lives ahead of them. But Rome would control northern Italy. The tactical innovations tested today would be refined and improved. Future battles would be won, with fewer casualties because of lessons learned in this valley. The systematic approach to warfare that Marcellus had pioneered would carry Roman eagles across continents. Whether that made the cost worthwhile was a question that would be debated by philosophers for centuries. But for the soldiers who had survived the Battle of Padus, the answer was simpler. They had done what Rome asked of them, and they would carry the weight of that for the rest of their lives. 3 hours after the fighting ended, Marcellus walked alone through the section of battlefield where the Celtic royal clan had made its final stand. The ground was thick with bodies, so many that in places you couldn't see the earth beneath them. The systematic efficiency that characterized Roman military operations had not yet reached this part of the field. Here, the dead lay where they had fallen. Brennus's body was easy to identify. Even in death, the Celtic war chief stood out. His massive frame, the bronze torque still around his neck, the 6 pilum wounds that had finally brought him down. Someone had closed his eyes. Marcellus didn't know whether it had been a Roman soldier showing respect to a worthy enemy or a surviving Celtic warrior saying goodbye to his chief before being led away to the prisoner pens. Marcellus knelt beside the body. Up close, he could see details that distance had hidden. The grey in Brennus's beard, the old scars that covered his arms and chest, the calluses on his hands from decades of gripping sword hilts. This wasn't some young warrior drunk on glory. This was a man who had spent his entire adult life fighting, who had survived dozens of battles, who had earned his position through skill and courage. And all that experience, all that accumulated knowledge, all that cultural tradition about how warriors should fight, it had meant nothing against systematic tactical innovation. "He fought well," said Albinus, approaching from behind. "Better than well. They all did. They fought like men defending something sacred." "They were," Marcellus replied, not looking up. "Their whole way of life, everything their culture valued, individual courage, glorious death in battle, the idea that strength and will could overcome any obstacle. We just proved all of it obsolete." Albinus stood quietly for a moment, studying the carnage. The battlefield held roughly 30,000 Celtic dead. Some had died from pylon wounds, bleeding out slowly. Others had been killed by gladius thrusts in the systematic close quarters fighting that Roman infantry specialized in. Many showed multiple wounds. They'd kept fighting long after injuries that would have sent civilized soldiers retreating to field hospitals. "Should we feel guilty about that?" Albinus asked. "About being better at killing than they were?" "I don't know," Marcellus admitted. "We did what Rome required. We found a way to win that minimized our casualties and maximized theirs. That's good generalship. Good tactics. But standing here among their dead, knowing that we didn't just defeat them, but made their entire warrior tradition irrelevant, it feels like we killed more than just men. We killed a whole way of understanding the world." He stood, his knees protesting the movement. "And that's what's going to happen everywhere Rome goes. We're not just conquering territory. We're replacing heroic warfare with systematic warfare, replacing cultural traditions with tactical efficiency. 100 years from now, nobody will fight the way Brennus fought. They'll all fight the way we fight, or they'll be extinct." Albinus considered this. "Is that wrong?" "I honestly don't know, but it's inevitable. We've proven that intelligence and organization beat courage and strength. Once that lesson is learned, it can't be unlearned. The age of heroes dies today. The age of systems begins." They walked in silence through the rows of dead, past Celtic warriors who would never return to their families, who would never teach their sons the old ways of fighting, who represented the end of something that had existed since humans first learned to make bronze swords. Near the edge of the battlefield, Marcellus found Roman burial details already at work. Each dead legionary was being identified, his name recorded in wax tablets, his personal effects carefully collected. The bodies would be cremated with full military honors. Their families would receive notification, along with any pay owed and the soldiers' savings from the legion's banking system. The Celts would be burned in mass pyres, their ashes scattered. Some Celtic prisoners had requested permission to sing the death songs for their fallen warriors. Marcellus had granted it. The singing had been going on for an hour now, haunting, melodic, in a language Marcellus didn't understand. But he understood grief. That was universal. "We should return to camp," Albinus suggested. "The men need to see you. They need to know their consul recognizes what they accomplished." Marcellus took one last look at Brennus's body. "What we accomplished was murder made efficient. We turned killing into a science. That's what they need to understand. Not that they should feel guilty, but that they should recognize the magnitude of what happened today. We didn't just win a battle, we changed the fundamental nature of warfare." As they walked back toward the Roman camp, Marcellus found himself thinking about all the future battles this victory would enable. The tactics proven today would be studied, refined, improved. Roman armies would use these principles to defeat enemies across 3 continents. Thousands of years from now, military academies would still be teaching the lessons learned in the Padus Valley, but would they remember the cost? Would they remember Brennus and his royal clan, who fought with absolute courage for a way of life that was ending? Would they remember the young Roman soldiers who died testing an unproven tactical theory? Probably not. History remembered victories and innovations. It rarely remembered the human beings who paid for them with their lives. 3 days after the battle, a delegation of surviving Allobroge chieftains arrived at the Roman camp under a flag of truce. They came on foot rather than horseback, a deliberate signal of submission. They carried no weapons. They wore no armor. Some had shaved their heads as a sign of mourning for the warriors who wouldn't return. Their leader was Ambiorix, younger brother of Brennus. Where the war chief had been massive and imposing, Ambiorix was leaner, quicker, with intelligent eyes that took in every detail of the Roman fortifications. He was in his mid-30s, old enough to have fought in multiple battles, but young enough to adapt to changing circumstances. Marcellus received the delegation in an open area near the camp center, surrounded by his senior officers. This was deliberate theater. He wanted the Celtic survivors to see Roman military organization on full display, the geometric precision of the tent lines, the systematic arrangement of equipment, the disciplined soldiers going about their duties with mechanical efficiency, everything the Celts were not. Ambiorix approached and executed a formal bow that suggested some familiarity with Roman customs. When he spoke, his Latin was accented but grammatically correct. Consul Marcus Claudius Marcellus, I come to offer the submission of the Allobroge Confederation to Roman authority. We acknowledge our defeat. We seek terms that will allow our people to survive. Marcellus studied the Celtic chieftain carefully. This wasn't broken desperation. It was pragmatic recognition of changed circumstances. Ambiorix understood what his brother had died learning. The old ways couldn't defeat Roman systematic warfare. Your brother fought with great courage, Marcellus said. His name will be recorded in our histories. His name will be sung in our songs, Ambiorix replied. But his way of fighting died with him. We must learn your ways, or our people will vanish from the earth. The honesty was striking. No appeals to honor, no demands for revenge, no vows of eternal resistance, just cold assessment of reality. What exactly are you proposing? Albinus asked. Ambiorix gestured to the chieftain standing behind him. The 6 surviving clans of the Confederation, perhaps 12,000 warriors total, plus their families, wished to be incorporated into the Roman system, not as slaves or subjects, but as allies. We would provide auxiliary troops to fight alongside your legions. We would maintain our traditional weapons and fighting methods, but under Roman command structure and Roman discipline. Nero stepped forward. You're offering to become foederati, allied troops? Yes, we recognize that we cannot maintain independence through military resistance, but we can maintain our culture, our language, our identity by becoming part of Rome's expansion rather than its victims. It was a shrewd proposal. Rome's military system had always incorporated auxiliary forces from conquered peoples, light infantry, cavalry, specialists in particular terrain or weapons. The Celts could provide valuable shock troops for campaigns where their aggressive close combat style would be useful, and incorporating them as allies rather than enslaved populations would reduce the resources needed to garrison the region. Marcellus considered the implications. This could establish a pattern for Roman expansion, not just conquest and subjugation, but integration of defeated peoples into the growing republic. Offer them a path to become part of Rome rather than enemies of Rome, and they might choose cooperation over resistance. Your young men would serve in auxiliary cohorts under Roman officers, Marcellus said, thinking aloud. They would learn Roman discipline and tactics. They would be deployed wherever Rome needs them, which might mean fighting far from your homeland. We understand, Ambiorix replied. Better to fight for Rome than die fighting against it. Your chieftains would retain authority over civilian matters, but military decisions would be made by Roman commanders. Accepted. You would pay annual tribute in grain and iron. You would provide intelligence about Germanic tribes to your north. You would allow Roman roads to be built through your territory. All accepted. We ask only that our culture be permitted to continue, that our language be allowed to be taught to our children, that our gods be respected even as we acknowledge Roman authority. Marcellus looked at Albinus, who gave a slight nod. The terms were favorable to Rome while offering the Celts a path forward that didn't involve extinction or slavery. Then I accept your submission on behalf of the Roman Senate and people. The Allobroge Confederation becomes a foederati ally of Rome, with all rights and responsibilities that entails. The ceremony that followed was brief and formal. Ambiorix and the other chieftains swore oaths to Rome, pledging their warriors and their loyalty. Roman scribes recorded everything in duplicate, one copy for the Senate archives, one copy for the Confederation's own records. What appeared to be a simple negotiation was actually the birth of a new pattern of imperial expansion. Over the following centuries, Rome would repeat this process hundreds of times across Europe, North Africa, and Asia, defeating enemies militarily, then offering them integration into the Roman system as a preferable alternative to destruction. The Celts who left the Padus Valley that day would never fight against Rome. Their sons and grandsons would serve in Roman auxiliary cohorts, earning citizenship and spreading Celtic fighting techniques throughout the empire. Their culture would survive, adapted and modified, woven into the complex multicultural system that Roman expansion created. Brennus had fought to preserve Celtic independence through military resistance. He had failed, and his approach had died with him. Ambiorix was preserving Celtic culture through pragmatic adaptation to Roman dominance. History would prove him successful. As the delegation departed, Nero approached his uncle. "That was brilliant. You just converted an enemy into an ally without spending another Roman life." "I converted them because Ambiorix was intelligent enough to recognize that survival requires adaptation," Marcellus corrected. His brother tried to preserve the old ways through courage and strength. Ambiorix is preserving his people through flexibility and compromise, different approaches to the same goal. Which one was right? Marcellus watched the Celtic chieftains walking away from the camp, asked their grandchildren in 50 years. They're the ones who'll live with the consequences of both choices. Word of the Padus victory reached Rome within a week. The Senate immediately voted to grant Marcellus a triumph, the highest military honor the Republic could bestow. But more importantly, the details of his tactical innovations spread through the Roman military establishment like fire through dry grass. Every ambitious young officer wanted to understand how Marcellus had achieved an 8-to-1 casualty ratio against an enemy that had previously defeated Roman armies consistently. Every centurion wanted to drill his men in the new formation. Every military theorist wanted to write treatises explaining the underlying principles. Gaius Marius, the young centurion who had questioned the plan's reliance on inter-unit trust, became one of the most enthusiastic advocates. He wrote a detailed letter to a friend serving with the legions in Hispania, describing the battle in tactical terms. What we achieved at Padus was not simply a victory, it was proof that human intelligence, systematically applied, can overcome any natural disadvantage. The Celts were stronger, more numerous, fighting on their own ground with cultural traditions that made them fearless in combat. By every conventional measure, they should have won. But we didn't fight conventionally. We analyzed their strengths and found ways to convert those strengths into vulnerabilities. Their aggression became the instrument of their encirclement. Their courage became the means of their destruction. We didn't match them strength for strength. We used system against heroism. This is what makes Roman arms supreme. Not our equipment, not our individual soldiers, but our willingness to constantly evolve our tactics based on what actually works, rather than what tradition demands. We became the masters of war itself by refusing to be bound by how our fathers fought. The letter was copied and circulated widely. Its principles influenced a generation of Roman officers who would carry the legions to victories across the Mediterranean world. In Hispania, Roman commanders facing Carthaginian armies began experimenting with similar tactical innovations, creating deliberate gaps to channel enemy elephants into killing zones, using controlled withdrawals to break up enemy formations, deploying reserves in mobile response units rather than static defensive lines. In Greece, officers studying the Macedonian phalanx recognized that its rigid structure made it vulnerable to the kind of flexible, adaptive tactics Marcellus had pioneered. They began developing combined arms approaches that would eventually shatter Alexander's tactical legacy at Cynoscephaly. In Africa, the lessons of Pardes would be refined into the tactics that finally cornered and destroyed Hannibal himself, the greatest military mind of his generation, undone by systematic Roman adaptation. But the most profound impact was psychological rather than tactical. The Roman soldiers who had fought at Pardes, and the thousands of others who heard the story, developed absolute confidence in the superiority of Roman military methods. They believed, with quasi-religious certainty, that Roman organization and discipline could overcome any enemy regardless of circumstances. That confidence became self-fulfilling. Soldiers who believe they're fighting for a superior system fight harder, maintain discipline under greater pressure, and execute complex maneuvers with more precision. The psychological advantage gained at Pardes proved as valuable as the tactical innovations themselves. Marcus Tullius Cicero, the young tribune who had worried about soldier morale before the battle, wrote in his personal journal, "I came to Pardes believing that warfare was about courage and strength. I left understanding that warfare is about systematic problem solving. The Celts were braver than us. They were individually stronger than us. But we were smarter than them, and in the end, that's what mattered. Rome doesn't produce the best individual warriors. We produce the best military system. And a superior system beats superior individuals every single time." 20 years after Pardes, as Rome's legions marched through the ruins of Carthage in final victory over their greatest rival, the tactical principles pioneered by Marcellus had become standard doctrine. The flexible, adaptive approach to warfare, analyzing enemy strengths, finding vulnerabilities, constantly evolving tactics based on battlefield results, was now simply how Romans fight. The specific formation used at Pardes was already obsolete, replaced by more refined versions. But the underlying principle remained constant. Victory goes to those who can adapt. Faster than their enemies can respond to the adaptations. This was Rome's true genius, not any particular tactical formation or weapon or strategy, but the systematic approach to military evolution that made the Republic into a learning organization. Every battle was a laboratory, every defeat was analyzed for lessons, every victory was studied to understand what had worked and why. The Celts had fought the same way for 1,000 years. In one afternoon, Rome had made that 1,000 years of tradition irrelevant. Pause for a moment and think about this. An entire military tradition, centuries old, proven in countless battles, deeply embedded in cultural identity, made obsolete in a single afternoon by systematic thinking and tactical innovation. It makes you wonder, what traditions in our own time are one innovation away from irrelevance? What things do we do simply because that's how it's always been done, without questioning whether there might be a better way? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and I'm genuinely curious what you think.